Good morning, folks, and welcome to June's risk reduction class, where we're going to be talking about the new and revised forms that'll be released in the June release later this month. So I want to give you a heads up. We're going to focus on primarily on one form that's actually been out since May, which is the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory, Disclosure, and Addendum. A lot of questions about that. So I'll go through that form, and then I will talk about 9 other forms, one other new form that hopefully none of you are really concerned about at all, and then 8 revised forms that may impact your day-to-day real estate careers. As always, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to contact me either by email or phone, of course, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that I didn't cover in this class or in any other time you have a question. All right, so let's talk about new and revised forms, the June 2021 release, which will come out, I think, the week of the 24th, around that time. These forms are, with the exception of one form, they're not out yet. The one form that is out, as I mentioned, is the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory, Disclosure, and Addendum, the FHDS. Quite a mouthful. Another new form is the Transfer of Listing Agreement, and I'll just briefly mention that form. Then 8 revised forms: a Cooperating Broker Compensation Agreement and Escrow Instruction, the CBC. I want to talk a little bit about that and also clarify some questions that frequently come up and the improper use, if you will, of the CBC. So we'll talk about that. The Agricultural Addendum, the Exempt Seller's Disclosure, Property Images Agreement, the Referral Fee Agreement, the Residential Listing Agreement, the RLA. I'm not going to talk about the other forms of listings, but all of the changes in the RLA are included in all the other listing, the open listing and the seller reserved listing contract. We're going to talk about a couple of changes, 3 actually, in the statewide buyer and seller advisory. And then finally, a relatively minor change to the seller's purchase of replacement property. All right, so as I said, we're going to focus primarily on the FHDS, the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory and Disclosure and Addendum. It's a 2-page form. It replaces the HHDA. If you have a contract now, an escrow now rather, and you have the HHDA as part of your contract, as long as it closes before July 1st, you're fine. You do not need to add the FHDS, the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory that we're going to talk about. You don't need to add that to your transaction. But if the transaction closes after July 1st, then you must use the FHDS, which we're going to talk about. You will not find this form in CAR forms any longer, in zip forms. It's been replaced, but you can still use it, like I said, as long as you've already used it, you've already filled it out, and you do close before July 1st. Okay, so the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory, Disclosure, and Addendum. The first thing I want to point out is it's an addendum to the purchase agreement. It should be included with the purchase agreement. And if the buyer's agent doesn't include it, then we recommend highly that the seller counter this form back to the seller and make it part of the contract. You're going to see why that's important in a few minutes as we get deeper into the form. So keep in mind, as a listing agent, it's going to be advisable that you counter in this form, because I'm not sure a lot of buyer's agents will provide it between the 2 offices. All right, so the first part of the form is the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory, and it talks about the law applicability relative to the fire hardening disclosure and the defensible space compliance and then inspection reports. So the first thing is the fire hardening disclosure, which is a part of this form, obviously. And this disclosure is required for sellers of residential properties of 1 to 4 units constructed before January 1st of 2010, located in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and the seller is required to do a TDS. This law is a part of Civil Code 1102, which is, the so-called TDS section of the Civil Code, and so it functions just like a TDS. So if the transaction is exempt from a TDS, for example, a successor trustee liquidating the assets of a deceased person, well, they're exempt from a TDS unless they've lived in the property in the last year. Probate is exempt from a TDS. REOs are exempt from TDSs, so they would not be required to do this form. But if a TDS is required, then this form is required, especially for properties built before January 1st, 2010, the fire hardening aspect of this form. Okay, defensible space compliance. That's disclosures and requirements specified in paragraph 4. And paragraph 4 talks about the requirements and then the compliance of defensible space law. And it affects residential properties containing 1 to 4 units located in a high or very high fire zone. And again, if the seller is required to do a TDS. Notice the difference between fire hardening disclosure, the top half of this form, and the defensible space compliance, the bottom half of this form. If the property is built before January 1st, 2010, then no fire hardening disclosure is required. However, a defensible space compliance section of this form is required for all properties that meet these criteria, which does not include the year built. So it doesn't matter when the property was built. If it's 1 to 4 units, it's residential in a high or very high fire zone, and you're required to do a TDS, you must also complete the defensible space compliance. So I would recommend you do the form in its entirety, regardless of year built, just as a level of caution, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. And then finally, the inspection report, including fire hardening and defensible space compliance, that is if a disclosure or final inspection report obtained under paragraph 5, which we'll talk about in a minute, that is where a seller has already gotten a report, frequently as a part of remodeling it, or if it's a newer construction, of course, the report was required also. So if they've already got a report on their fire hardening and defensible space compliance, then that report, that report is for residential properties, 1 to 4 units, obligated to do a TDS. The seller is required to provide such a report as a part of the contract or as a voluntary disclosure. So if the seller, in some cases, you're going to have a seller who already has a defensible space and fire hardening report, and so they're to provide that. Hope I haven't lost you yet. So fire hardening disclosure must be done for the properties that we itemized here in paragraph A1, 1A1, and defensible space compliance is for properties itemized in 1A2, basically the same, except the year built does not apply to defensible space compliance. So where does a seller locate the information about whether their property is in a a high or very high fire zone, and whether they're required to provide these disclosures. Well, they can consult with a natural hazard zone company, literally call the company. Agents, you can call your rep. If you volunteer to assist the seller, be very careful if it's a negative. In other words, if the HOA says, no, don't worry. The natural hazard company says, no, don't worry about it. It's not in a high or very high zone. You'd want to get that in writing if you're consulting with somebody. If they say yes, it is, well, then you're going to provide the report anyway, the disclosure anyway, rather. So be cautious if you are getting the negative, because later you could find out that the person you consulted with at the NHD company was making a mistake. A better way might be to review the report. And we're going to talk about the importance of getting that report early in a transaction. In fact, as a listing agent, when you first take the listing, or you can check with a local agency as to whether or not your property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. Okay, if the property is not in either zone, either high or very high fire hazard zone, then the seller might still determine, or if the seller can't determine if his property is in one of those zones, the seller might still determine that he wants to provide this report, this disclosure, because the property is in a mountainous area, forest covered lands area, brush covered lands, grass covered lands, or any land that's covered by flammable material. So the seller may choose to make this report even if they're not required. Again, the requirement for fire hardening and defensible space is only for properties in high or very high fire zones. But again, a seller might want to err on the side of caution. You might be surprised. I was sort of surprised to realize, and actually I shouldn't have been, but my home is in a high fire zone, and I'm in the middle of the suburbs in Scripps Ranch. But of course, we've had a couple of fires in Scripps Ranch, so I shouldn't have been surprised. There are sections of Mira Mesa, which is very, very suburban, if you will. They're in a high fire zone, and that's true of all of our offices, including All Pro. You have lots of areas that you might be surprised you're in a high or very high fire zone. So err on the side of caution, and providing this form is probably a good idea. You can make this voluntary disclosure even if you're not mandated by law. All right. Now, the fire severity zone, the default is that the home is in a high or very high fire zone. And so that's why you're providing the form. Or you can check the box and say it's not in a high or very high fire zone, but you're providing this form as an advisory anyway, and you're completing paragraph 3B below as a voluntary gesture. You're required to complete 3B if you're in a high or very high fire hazard zone, but you can still answer those questions as a voluntary measure. And again, we recommend that. In fact, we're very close to requiring this on all transactions just to be safe. Okay, now paragraph 3 contains, it's only required if the criterion 1A are met. And remember, the criterion 1A is residential 1 to 4 units built before January 1st of 2010 and in a high or very high zone. Then this statement must be provided to the buyer by civil code. And the statement includes what the civil code requires, and that is providing a website where the buyer can get more information. So this is the mandatory statutory notice that is required for properties that have those criteria that I've just mentioned a few minutes ago. Paragraph 3B is the fire hardening vulnerabilities, where the seller is talking about features they're aware of that make the homes susceptible to wildfires and flying embers. Now, the seller would check all that apply. And again, the seller is answering what they're aware of. The seller is aware of. So they may not be aware of a feature. And if they're not aware of it, they don't have to check the box. So B1 is eaves, soffits, and roof ventilation where the vents have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch and are not flame or ember resistant. So I would suggest a lot of sellers aren't going to have a clue as to whether B1 is a feature of their property or not. So they may not check one. Buyer's agent should be aware that when a box is not checked, it does not mean that these vulnerabilities do not exist. It simply means the seller is not aware of the vulnerability. Okay, just to give you a little panic attack here, don't worry too much, but in 2025, the seller is going to be required to make an affirmative statement. Whether he's aware of it or not doesn't matter. He has to determine if he has these features. Of course, that'll be in 2025, and there'll probably be professional inspectors that will be familiar with who can inspect homes for these sorts of things and make these sorts of declarations. But for now, the seller only has to talk about what he's aware of. Roof coverings made of untreated wood shingles or shakes. A seller might be more aware of that if they have such a roof. Combustible landscaping or other materials within 5 feet or under the footprint of an attached deck. Single pane windows, loose or missing bird stoppings and roof flashing. Again, something most sellers probably won't have a clue about. And then rain gutters without metal or non-combustible gutter covers. Now, as I said, you can check all that applies. So a seller who's probably aware that he has a wood shake roof, he's got bushes up against his house, and he's got single pane glass windows, he's probably going to be able to check these 3 boxes if all those 3 were true. So you check all that apply. So that is the fire hardening portion of the disclosure. And now in paragraph 4, we move into the defensible space requirements. There's basically 2 ways to look at this. One is fire hardening are features of a home that make the home less susceptible to fires. That's what we discussed up till now. The second thing we're talking about is defensible space, and that is space surrounding the home, in most cases 100 feet around the home, that could allow a fire to creep up upon a home. And so that's the second portion of this form, and this is the new part of the fire hardening and defensible space code, if you will, and forms, because the fire hardening aspects went into effect July 1. The defensible space aspects, the fire hardening aspects went into effect January 1. The defensible space requirements went into effect July 1, or will be going into effect on properties closing on July 1 or later. So the first part of the defensible space requirements is a defensible space advisory. Now, this advisory points something out that is similar to low flow plumbing fixtures. Whether or not a house has low flow plumbing fixtures, it doesn't, is something that's disclosable. The code requires homes are supposed to have low flow plumbing fixtures. Now, it's not a point of sale requirement, but it is a civil code requirement. The same with defensible space. Defensible space, whether you're selling your home or not, whether you have a buyer involved in a transaction or not, a homeowner is required under Public Resources Code to maintain a defensible space within 100 feet of his property currently. So every home that's in a high or very high fire zone is supposed to, as we speak now, have a defensible space compliance. And where we're concerned about it is when we are selling the property, because the code also has effective, first of all, local jurisdictions have also enacted codes as well as the state code, and effective July 1, Civil Code 1102 requires disclosure of whether or not you're in compliance with defensible space requirements for certain properties, 1 to 4 residential units, in a high or very high fire zone where a TDS is required. So again, keep in mind, everybody's required to maintain defensible space if they're in the fire zone. We're concerned with disclosing the status of that to buyers when we're involved in a sale or transaction. So defensible space compliance, there are 4 possibilities. Now, the first is that there is no local ordinance, and the buyer will obtain documentation of compliance. Will get that to the state within 1 year. So no local ordinance. There is a state ordinance, and the state ordinance says that that within 1 year of close of escrow, the buyer shall obtain documentation that their property is in compliance with the defensible space requirements. That's the default. Now, 2B, now this also talks about whether or not there are inspectors. There probably will be inspectors. The state has hired a bunch of inspectors, and right now most fire departments are conducting inspections. But if you cannot get an inspector, then you're excused from, if there's none available, then you're excused from complying with this. That's probably not going to apply. B2, there is no local ordinance, just like B1. However, the seller has, in the last 6 months, obtained documentation that their property is in compliance with defensible space requirements. Where this will be most common is if the seller, either on their own, went ahead and hired or contacted the local fire department and had them do the inspection, had the state do the inspection. The state wasn't doing a lot of inspections until now. They've hired a bunch of inspectors just recently, so they're ready for this July 1 rollout, if you will. Or more commonly, the seller has remodeled the home, and part of the permitting process, if his home is in a high or very high fire zone, was required to get a certification, documentation, if you will, that the property is in compliance with defensible space law. So although there's no local ordinance that required it, building departments required it, and so the seller may have that documentation that he had got it within the last 6 months. And if he has that, then he would provide it to the buyer within 7 days of acceptance. If you have any questions, by the way, Lindsay's monitoring the chat, and we'll also open it up to questions here at the end. A little confusing. I hope I'm not confusing you. I hope I'm clarifying it a little bit. It is quite a bit to go through. Okay, paragraph 3, the third option is that there is a local ordinance, and the buyer is supposed to obtain documentation of compliance with the defensible space law. And in many cases, the local ordinance will allow either the seller or the buyer to obtain documentation. And the seller shall comply with the requirements of the ordinance after close of escrow. The buyer shall. So this is an option where either the seller or the buyer can obtain the documentation, because civil code, the local civil code, the local code, if you will, allows either the seller or the buyer to obtain the documentation. And then finally, the fourth option is there is a local ordinance in effect, and that local ordinance states that the seller shall provide, which means must, provide documentation that the property is in compliance with defensible space law. So if there is a local ordinance requiring the seller to provide that proof of compliance of defensible space laws, then that is to be done prior to close of escrow. If the seller's already gotten the documentation, like I said before, they got a permit and they already got that documentation, they provide it within 7 days of acceptance. If they do not have documentation yet, if the local code is in effect and the local code requires the seller to provide documentation, then the seller must obtain documentation and provide it to the buyer 5 days prior to the close of escrow. So you're going to want to inquire, and the best place to inquire right now is the local fire departments, because the fire departments, CAR believes the fire departments are a pretty good source. CAR is, and they hope to have it done before July 1, going to put together a matrix. I'm going to keep my eye out for it. And as soon as it's available, I'll let everybody know. But they're going to try to put together sort of a matrix, if you will, of all the local authorities and what their requirements are. So that will allow you to go to that source and decide whether paragraph 4 applies or not. Okay. Finally, paragraph 5, if 2 or 4 is checked, and of course 2 and 4 are that either the seller has documentation, there's no local ordinance, that's 2, or the seller must provide documentation, then that documentation can be obtained from the following location, and you put that in, and the contact information, the phone number there. And then finally, the final inspection report, that's only required if 1A3 applies. 1A3 is residential 1 to 4 TDS qualified properties, if you will, properties that require a TDS. And they have a final inspection report, then they provide that, or they state that the report can be obtained, and check the box, and where can the report be obtained? Okay, so the seller represents, when they sign this, that to the best of their knowledge, the answers on the form are correct. And again, it's to the best of their knowledge. So they, it's not a form that they cannot fill out, because they're only asked, what are you aware of, especially in the fire hardening top half of the form. And that the answers are correct, and that the seller acknowledges receipt of the form and agrees to all the terms specified in paragraph 4B. And 4B are the compliance section, those 4 different compliance options. The buyer, when they sign, acknowledges receipt of this advisory disclosure and addendum and agrees to the applicable terms in paragraph 4B. Now, where this is important, where a seller is going to want to put this into the counteroffer, you want the buyer to accept the responsibility of getting, if the local code allows it, the state does allow the buyer to get confirmation, written confirmation, a report stating the property is in compliance with defensible space requirements. The only of the 4 options, only the 4th one requires the seller to do it. So you would like to counter it, and absent the local authority requiring it, which is not real common, then the seller would want the buyer to accept responsibility. And you checked, I think, 2B, that paragraph there, that the buyer would accept responsibility, and the seller does not have to get the report as a condition of closing escrow. If you add this form in the middle of a transaction, you could have a buyer who refuses to agree to that. And now you've got a problem. That problem can probably be resolved by you providing it as an advisory and disclosure, not as an addendum, and the buyer has to acknowledge the disclosure, and that might, leverage the buyer to accepting that the buyer will be responsible for complying to the defensible space requirements. But it could be problematic. So hopefully I've made a good case for why, as a listing agent, this is yet another form you're going to want to include. Excuse me. You're going to want to include with a counteroffer. And again, probably checking the second option of the 4 options in paragraph 4B. All right, that takes care of the FHDS, Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory. And if you still have questions on it at the end of the class here, we'll talk about it. And also call me and I'll see if I can't guide you. There'll be more information towards the 1st of July, especially what the local ordinances are and what local fire districts do have a requirement for the seller to provide defensible space compliance prior to close of escrow. Okay, the next form is a transfer of listing agreement. I only mention this because it does have an option where, an agent who does not want a listing and wants to refer it to another agent from another company, they can do that with this form. This form is also useful, and hopefully you'll never want it, if you change companies and the broker is agreeable to letting you take your listings with you. Hopefully the agents that we hire in the future will want this form, but none of our current agents are going to be too concerned about this form, hopefully. Okay, the Cooperating Broker Compensation Agreement Escrow Instruction, the CBC, that's been modified quite a bit, but the modifications aren't all that extreme. So I just want to take you through the form a little bit, and I want to take the opportunity, because it comes up all the time, to discuss how commissions are legally paid, how a entity is bound to pay a commission. There are basically 2 types of contracts involving the payment of a commission. One is a contract between an agent and a principal. That would be the seller or the buyer. So between the agent and his client. The other contract is between agents. So the contract between an agent and the principal, the client, the commission agreement has several specifics in civil code that it must contain. Number 1, it must be in writing. Number 2, it must state that commissions are negotiable. There's no fixed commission. The size of the font is specified as not being smaller than the largest font of any other paragraph on the contract, and the fact that commissions are negotiable and not fixed must be in bold type. Absent all of that, you cannot enforce a commission payment. So what does that mean? What that means is, the point I want to make is, this form here is not to be used between your client and you. Every once in a while, an agent who is, selling a property and the property's not listed, it's not in the MLS, but the seller is agreeable to pay a commission, the agent will incorrectly use this cooperating broker compensation agreement as a way of memorializing the commission. It is totally useless between a agent and a principal. Where this form comes into play is that second type of contract that governs the payment of a commission, and that is a contract between agents. So when a listing agent lists the property, the listing agent and the seller agree that the seller will pay the listing agent a commission. For argument's sake, let's use 6%. So the seller says, all right, I'll pay you 6%. And the agent says, I'll give half of that to a co-op agent. So lower on the page 1 of the listing contract is a place where you tell the seller that commission you're going to offer to the co-op agent. Okay, so the seller is paying a commission pursuant to the contract, the listing contract between the listing agent and the seller. Every agent who's joined an MLS has signed a contract. They may not realize it, but it's part of your joining paperwork when you join, that says that you will pay whatever commission you put in the MLS, commission to buyer broker. You also will accept whatever commission is in the MLS as commission that the seller's agent will pay you. And so that's the contract that you're modifying with this form. This form is modifying. In one case, it actually reaffirms, but in most cases, it modifies the contract that already existed because a listing agent put a CBC, a commission to buyer, CBB, as a commission to buyer broker in the MLS, and the buyer's agent already agreed to accept that when they wrote an offer. That's why commissions are not part of an offer. I'm going to give you a little tip on that in a moment, though. Okay, so if you want to modify that agreement, then you use this form, and the other agent agrees to it. So first of all, you identify who, in paragraph 2, you identify who the buyer brokerage is and who the buyer's agent is, and who the buyer is, rather. So top line here, the buyer, broker, and agent, and then the buyer that we're talking about here. Okay. Then the paragraph 3 is sort of the meat of the form, if you will, and that is where, number 1, you could confirm that you're accepting the compensation in the MLS. Now you can check that box. The default is paragraph 3B, you're modifying it, or you're attempting to modify it. So as a buyer's agent, you don't like the commission that's in the MLS, so you change the percentage, or you put a dollar amount in. And so that is the modification you want to the MLS offer of compensation. Now, this is A and B apply if you are a member of the MLS or a reciprocal MLS. Most of the MLSs in our area are reciprocal, with the exception of Arrowhead and Big Bear. I don't believe they're reciprocal yet. They have a lot of problems with LA agents sending their buyers up to Big Bear and Arrowhead, and then when they're ready to write an offer, coming back to LA and having their local agent write the offer. So a long time ago, Arrowhead and Big Bear stopped reciprocating. So, but most of the other MLSs, I believe, are reciprocal in our area. So if you're a member of the MLS or you're reciprocal, then either you check A, you're confirming the compensation in the MLS if you choose to, or B, which is default, you are modifying it to whatever you put in those 2 blanks, either one or the other, or both if you want it. Or C, if the cooperating broker is not a member of the MLS or a reciprocal MLS, then there is no agreement between that agent and the listing agent to pay a commission. So you create that agreement with this agreement, and you either put a percentage or a dollar amount. And then finally, D is if there's a short sale compensation, and that commission is subject to a lender approval, is in the MLS, then you're accepting the fact that the property is a short sale. That's not too common right now. That'll maybe come back when the market turns. Okay. Now, if the property is not listed in the MLS, the buyer's broker compensation shall be, and that is sometimes a listing agent takes a listing but doesn't put it in the MLS. So the buyer broker, who maybe has gotten permission to show the property and now writes to write an offer, the buyer's broker has no agreement with the listing broker to pay the commission that the listing broker got from the seller. So this is common, paragraph 4, with a single party showing, and you don't have the buyer, but you know an agent who does have a buyer. So you can do a single party showing, list the other agent as a co-op agent, and then that agent would want to execute this form, which is between you, the listing agent, and the buyer's broker. Again, this form is not between principals and agents, it's between agents and agents. And then finally, 5, you can check 5 if you as an agent procure a tenant for a homeowner, or for a lease listing where an agent put it in as a lease listing, and then you provided a tenant, and then later that tenant buys the property, then you could specify that you're entitled to a compensation. Okay, paragraph 7 and 8 talk about that any modification to a commission agreement requires broker approval. And especially in paragraph 8, if the commission is reduced, then the buyer's broker must sign for that. So that's important, listing agent. So the buyer's agent says, oh, no, I'm going to take less money. I'm buying this house for my daughter and her husband, my son-in-law, and you don't need to pay me a commission. Well, that commission doesn't belong to the buyer's agent. It belongs to the buyer's broker. So reducing that commission must be approved by the buyer's broker. So the signature line sort of makes that clear. And if you have a situation like that and you're a little confused, call me and I'll walk you through it. But the form's been modified to make it real clear that the buyer's broker must approve, or the manager, office manager, must approve a reduction in commission. Nobody's going to get upset if you're paying a more commission than you originally put in the MLS. But if you're reducing the commission, you could run afoul of the brokerage, even though the agent said it was okay. Okay, the Agricultural Addendum AGAD. This is a real simple change. In paragraph 2, civil code now allows the growing of marijuana on property. So this discusses the fact that the property may have marijuana cultivation. So that's pretty simple modification. The seller exempt disclosure, that's also a very, very relatively minor change. In the original exempt seller disclosure, it implied that non-compliant fixtures must be replaced on single-family homes. That's not what the Civil Code says. The Civil Code says that non-compliant plumbing fixtures must be replaced on single-family or multifamily homes. So apartment buildings have to have non-compliant fixtures. And again, I mentioned it before as an illustration. This is not a point of sale requirement. It's Civil Code right now. If you have a house right now that has a old toilet on it and it's not a low flow toilet, the law says you're supposed to replace that toilet, period. As a point of sale, you have to disclose whether you did it or not. You don't have to do it, with the exception, the only exception I know in our area is City of San Diego. City of San Diego requires a certification that you have in fact replaced your toilets, or that the buyer will, your low flow fixtures. But other than that, there's no point of sale requirement to replace them. There is a point of sale requirement to, number one, state that the law says they're supposed to be low flow. That's what this section right here says, and it includes multifamily. And then number 2, K, paragraph K, if you didn't replace them and you know that your plumbing fixtures are non-compliant, the code also says, number 1, you have to tell the buyer that low flow fixtures are supposed to be installed. Number 2, no, I haven't installed them. So, are you aware of the property having non-compliant plumbing fixtures? So although I said, no, I haven't installed them, I should have been more careful. No, you haven't installed them means you check yes, the property does contain non-compliant plumbing fixtures. The other thing I'll point out when the final form comes out in June, J and K, I believe, will be switched. Carr made an observation recently. They want material facts to be the last thing. So all these blanks below, it seems logical that you could just write down any material facts that the seller's aware of. When a seller is exempt from certain disclosures, they are never exempt from disclosing a material fact. Nobody is. Anybody that sells real property must disclose a material fact if they're aware of it. And so this form could be important when a seller is disclosing material facts. There are certain other things you have to disclose, even if you're exempt from a TDS, like a death on a property in the last 3 years, an insurance claim. You've been given an order from a government authority to, do a drug cleanup on the property, things like that. Okay, that takes care of the ESD. The Property Images Agreement, the PIA, simply not modified. It added a drone use and indemnification paragraph. So it simply says that the photographer may, in fact, use a drone. And if he does, they number one know how to do it. They know how to use drones. And number two, any damages they cause or any claims made against them, and therefore maybe the broker who hired them, that the photographer will indemnify and pay any liability costs as a result of drone use, sort of separate the agent from the responsibility of maybe misuse of a drone. Okay, the referral fee agreement, that's been very simply modified, and it now parallels the listing agreement. I get this call every once in a while. Walt, we're in escrow and now my listing's expired. What do? I don't want to lose my commission. Well, the listing agreement says commission's paid if the property enters into a contract. Then even if the listing expires during that contract time, the commission is still owed. The referral agreement wasn't as clear as that. So the referral agreement has been modified. It says now a referral agreement is due to the referring agent if the principal enters into a contract to buy, sell, or lease whatever you check, whatever you're referring. And it does not matter whether it's closed or not. It matters that they entered into a contract prior to the expiration time. Fairly simple, straightforward, but important change. Now, the residential listing agreement, the RLA, and the other two agreements, the RLAN and the RL seller reserved one, they contain the same changes. I'm going to walk you through the RLA. The first thing they changed was they talked about days on market, and they wanted to make sure that the seller understands there's no standard way to calculate days on market. Some MLSs include off-market time in the calculation of days on market. Other MLSs give you an option of when to start the days on market, and some don't even start the days on market until it becomes active. So the sellers to discuss that with the broker and discuss the days on market. And that's important because a lot of sellers, some agents, a lot of sellers don't like extended days on markets with their listings. They have agents have fueled that a little bit by using that as sort of a technique to get sellers to do other things they should do by talking about, oh, you don't want to be on the market a long time. You have a tired, worn out listing. A house will, not receive the same attention when it's been on the market for 6 months as it will when it's been on the market 1 month. I won't go into a debate on that, whether it's true or not, but those conversations do occur. So you want to be sure that you discuss with the seller how days on market will be calculated based upon if they're going to do a coming soon or keep it off the market for a while after they first listed. Okay, there's also been a paragraph added regarding the buyer letters, or what we euphemistically call the buyer love letters. So they talk about the new HHDA form. It's not new. It came out toward the end of last year, but relatively new. And the fact that the buyer letters could be problematic. They could contain photos and information that could signify a person's protected class, and that is problematic. And so the first thing it says is that the broker will not review the content of buyer letters. The default is that the seller tells the broker not to present buyer letters. So I don't want to see the buyer letters. That's what the seller is telling the broker, the listing agent. I want to see my offers, but separate the buyer letters from it. And the listing agent is authorized to put in the MLS that buyer letters will not be presented to the seller. Or if checked, the seller can instruct the broker, no, I want to see those letters. It's not impossible. I've coached a couple of agents. I've talked about it on a call. There are a couple of things you can probably put in a letter that might help you, but you want to be very, very careful to avoid, inadvertently putting in things you shouldn't be putting in a letter. So this talks about the fact that, a letter could be very carefully crafted and might not be problematic, but it is against the broker's advice to allow this presentation of buyer letters. Now, 10E is being modified as part of the broker and seller's duties on the listing contract, and it's including a default. Notice it's defaulted to order the NHD immediately. I think that's going to be the new standard. It should be the standard. Why? Because you need to know whether or not you got an FHDS problem, a fire hardening and defensible space advisory disclosure and addendum issue, because you're in a high or very high fire zone. And you may not want to wait till you're already in escrow because, like I said before you get in escrow, you may want to include the HDS as part of your counter. So what does that mean in simple English? Get the NHD immediately, review it so you can plan appropriately when offers come in. So the default in the listing contract is that the seller is authorizing and will pay for the NHD report. Now, good news is, and you confirm that with your favorite company, I think it's still true, nobody pays an NHD company until it closes escrow. So you order a report and it doesn't close escrow. The seller changes their mind or the listing is canceled for some reason, it expires. There's no money lost. However, if the NHD company does charge, this contract does authorize the payment for that report. Same with a preliminary title. I'm glad to see that's on there, and this box should be checked. Preliminary title should be ordered when you take a listing. So you can go through, and I've talked about this in the past, every listing agent, when they take a listing, should get a prelim and should click on every single link and review what that link is. And if you've got a question, talk to the title company, call me, call Larry, call Mary, call Kenny, call Cheyenne. There's plenty of resources for you to help you with what that link is. And I can't tell you how many problems could have been avoided had agents, before they got into a contract, had an understanding of what was in the preliminary title report. So this box, I highly recommend you check it and then you order it immediately. There's also opportunity to have a roof inspection, pool inspection, septic inspection, or any other inspection, a pest control, a general property inspection if you want. But the two that I think are big, number one, natural hazard, it's so big it's defaulted in there. And number two, the preliminary title should be a standard practice. All right. There's also a thing in here. I don't want to get you too alarmed, but the Department of Justice, the DOJ, I think I mentioned this before, some of you are aware of it, has sued NAR and every other realtor organization in the country. And then they filed a settlement for that suit the very next day, a proposed settlement for that suit the very next day. Well, the proposed settlement contained a lot of things that NAR wasn't too excited about. And so we did not agree to that settlement, but we definitely saw the handwriting on the wall. NAR and CAR and every other state agency saw the handwriting on the wall. And so they are currently, NAR is in the negotiations with the Department of Justice on a settlement. The Department of Justice wants to make buyer compensation 100% transparent. That is probably going to happen. Right now, many of the MLSs do not allow the buyer broker compensation to be public facing. In other words, if you get a feed through an IDX and you go to some private website, that the public sees, even Remax International, when they present property information, when Zillow presents property information, you don't see the compensation of the buyer broker. The Department of Justice believes that the compensation of buyer broker is a material fact to the cost of the property. I would think they're probably right. And so they believe it should be negotiable between buyer and seller. That's going to happen, folks. So the buyer broker agreement is going to become real important in the future. So, that's a little premature yet because we don't know for sure what the exact terms of the settlement are. CAR has already modified the buyer broker agreements. There's 3 of them, but I don't believe they're going to be releasing them yet because they want to wait until they get more from the DOJ. The DOJ is participating in a couple of other lawsuits that impact all this. So that's coming on the horizon. What is another part, believe it or not, of the DOJ's lawsuit is they want lockboxes to be accessible. To whom? Well, basically to anybody who wants to see the property and doesn't have an agent. In other words, just like in the old days, the government felt like we were keeping property information hidden through our MLS, and now that's become somewhat public, right? They feel the same way about lockboxes. We're preventing people that are not members of our private organization, i.e. the MLS, from getting into houses, opening lockboxes and getting into houses. Well, duh, of course we're doing that. But there is movement afoot that is going to somewhat maybe have an impact on how lockboxes are handled. So CAR has proactively reaffirmed the fact that lockbox access is going to be controlled by the agent with the seller's permission. And the seller can opt, if they want, to allow an agent to authorize people other than members of our MLS to the lockbox, but that's an option. So I'm going to suggest that this box not be checked. If you do have a non-participant who wants to get into the property, you should be thinking very carefully about how wise that is. So that's what this is all about. That's why that's in there. It's sort of a preemptive move, if you will, to sort of reaffirm that we still want to maintain control of lockboxes. So that's my little soapbox message to you. Okay, statewide buyer and seller advisory, that's been modified in about 3 different ways, I think, if I remember right. The first is the table of contents has been modified. It looks a little better, if you will. And right at the top, it breaks down the categories very simply, and then it discusses each and every item and what page you can find them. And the items are alphabetically listed. So it's very, very nicely organized. It is a beautiful form, I think. They've really, really made this form a very client-friendly form. All right. Now, they've added the fire hardening and wildfire disaster information, including a lot of sources of additional information. That's been added to the SBSA. And they also added a wildlife paragraph. That a lot of properties have wildlife impacting the property, and that could impact the property owner, for example, animal resistant garbage containers and things like that. And then finally, sea level, with global warming and the concern about sea level rise, they've added a paragraph about your beachfront property may not be the same in the near future or the far future due to sea level rising. And it gives you some sites to go to for that as well. And then the last form, and then we'll jump into questions, is the seller's purchase of replacement property. Very minor modification. The form didn't allow for the 1A contingency, the identifying a replacement property, to include a rental property. In other words, the seller might decide, you know what, I'm not going to buy a property after all, but I still want to sell mine. I'll just rent a property. So they added identifying a suitable property to move into, which means, in other words, any property that the seller says, I'm fine, I'm going to move into that property. I'm renting it, I'm buying it, it doesn't matter. So the 1A finding a property contingency includes now finding a rental. So as you know, in the seller purchase of replacement property, there's two contingencies. One is the finding a replacement property, a place that you can move to, and then and that's in the default. And then if you check the box, closing escrow on the replacement property. I would argue most of your sellers are going to want you to check 1C as well, the finding and the closing escrow. Folks, that completes a quick review of the new forms with an emphasis on the FHDS. And Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a few.
Okay.
Bibiana wants to know if the FHDS also applies to condos and townhomes.
Yes, it does. Great question. Two things about that. Thanks for that question, by the way. It does apply to condos and townhouses. However, the responsibility of the defensible space and may fall within the HOA's jurisdiction. So you'll have to clarify that. And the Civil Code does allow for the fact that the HOA may be the one responsible for the defensible space. The other thing, and this comes up from time to time, and it's sort of interesting to think about it, the law mostly talks about within 100 feet of the property, and a lot of our properties, certainly within 100 feet of my property, I'm in the middle of my neighbor's backyard. So how can I be responsible for my neighbors? Well, the law also says to your property line. So don't worry too much about 100 feet if if your property is less than 100 feet away, in distance from your home, from the edge of your property. However, keep this in mind. If 100 feet takes you to the middle of your neighbor's backyard, he or she has the same problem you've got. They're supposed to have defensible space also. So they should be doing whatever they need to do on their property, which would then allow, you to have at least a level of comfort that you have that 100-foot buffer zone, if you will. Okay.
So Sharon Miller wants to know, how do we know if there is a local ordinance?
Well, right now, CAR is recommending that you call the fire jurisdiction in the area where the property is located. Again, don't call your fire department. Calling San Diego Fire Department to ask about a Fallbrook local ordinance would be a mistake. Same with, in Lancaster, call the Lancaster local fire department. They believe those folks are tuned up. They know. CAR is working on a list that will be available before July 1. So it'll be, and they're working on it, frantically, my words, but they are working on it. They want to create a list of all of the local ordinances so that we can reference it. So I'll keep my eye out for that. If you have trouble and you're running up against a dead end, give me a call and I'll assist you in researching that. But right now, call the local fire authority and stay tuned to a statewide list that CAR will put out.
Okay, Dave Zeman asks, regarding the FHDS paragraph 4, is it our responsibility to gather this info, or do we task our sellers with this?
That's a great question. CAR is actually trying to create a bit of an awareness that is probably beyond the expertise of an agent to make those determinations. So what I would do is I would not be the definitive source. I would assist my client if I wanted to be client friendly in determining this. It's not 100% clear that if a client, goofs up, whether they can hold their agent accountable or not. Like I said, CAR is trying to establish that it is not part of what's required for licensing. That might change in the future as the DRE adds this sort of stuff to licensing requirements. So, to summarize, it's okay to assist your client, to guide them a little bit. And again, when you're coming up positive, yeah, you're in a fire zone. Yeah, you need to do this. No one's going to sue you because you over disclose. No one's going to sue you because you made your property compliant when you didn't have to. It's where you were supposed to and didn't that you could have a problem. So err on the side of caution.
Okay, Anne. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Anne is asking the verbiage for the to counter the FHDS into the offer, and she's wondering if this wording is correct. Car form FHDS shall be included in this offer and check option 4B2.
Right. Well, you would check 4B2 and the seller would sign it just like they signed the counter. So you wouldn't tell them what, 4B2 is. You wouldn't tell them what to check. You would provide it with that check. But that language in general, yes, FHDS shall be a part of this agreement, and attached herein, form FHDS, car form FHDS attached shall be a part of this agreement. And then you fill it out.